Hello again, and this is the read along, read aloud for the Selma to Montgomery March reading. Selma to Montgomery March. The Selma to Montgomery March was part of a series of civil rights protests that occurred in 1965 in Alabama, a southern state with deeply entrenched racist policies. In March of that year, in an effort to register Black voters in the South, protesters marching the 54-mile route from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery were confronted by deadly violence from local authorities and white vigilante groups. As the world watched, the protesters, under the protection of the federalized National Guard troops, finally achieved their goal, walking around the clock for 3 days to reach Montgomery, Alabama. The historic march and Martin Luther King Jr.'s participation in it raised awareness of the difficulties faced by Black voters and the need for a national voting rights act. Voter registration efforts in Alabama. Even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 forbade discrimination in voting on the basis of race, the efforts of civil rights organizations such as the Southern Christian Leadership Council and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to register Black voters was met with fierce resistance in southern states such as Alabama. But the civil rights movement was not easily deterred. In early 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC decided to make Selma, located in Dallas County, Alabama, the focus of Black voter registration campaign. King had won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, and his profile would help draw international attention to the events that followed. Alabama Governor George Wallace was a notorious opponent of desegregation, and the local county sheriff in Dallas County had led a steadfast opposition to Black voter registration drives. As a result, only 2% of Selma's eligible Black voters, about 300 out of 15,000, had managed to register to vote. Did you know Ralph Bunche, who participated in the Selma to Montgomery March with Martin Luther King Jr., won the Nobel Prize in 1950 for his successful negotiation of an Arab-Israeli truce in Palestine a year earlier? Bloody Sunday. On March 18th, white segregationists attacked a group of peaceful demonstrators in the town of Marion, Alabama. In the ensuing chaos, an Alabama state trooper fatally shot Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young African-American demonstrator. In response to Jackson's death, King and the SCLC planned a massive protest march from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery, 54 miles away. A group of 600 people, including activists John Lewis and Hosea Williams, were set out from Selma on Sunday, March 7, 1965, a day that would be known as Bloody Sunday. The marchers didn't get far before Alabama state troopers wielding whips, nightsticks, and tear gas rushed the group at the Edmund Pettus Bridge and beat them back to Selma. The brutal scene was captured on television, enraging many Americans and drawing civil rights and religious leaders of all faiths to Selma in protests. Hundreds of ministers, priests, rabbis, social activists soon headed to Selma to join the voting rights march. Edmund Pettus Bridge. On March 9th, King led more than 2,000 marchers, Black and white, across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but found Highway 80 blocked again by state troopers. King paused the marchers and led them in prayer, whereupon troopers stepped aside. King then turned the protesters around, believing that the troopers were trying to create an opportunity that would allow them to enforce a federal injunction prohibiting the march. The decision led to criticism from some of the protesters, who called King cowardly. That night, a group of segregationists attacked another protester, a young white minister named James Reeb, beating him to death. Alabama state officials, led by Wallace, tried to prevent the march from going forward. but a U.S. District Court judge ordered them to permit it. LBJ addresses the nation. 6 days later, on March 15th, President Lyndon B. Johnson went on national television to pledge his support to the Selma protesters and to call for a passage of a new voting rights bill that he was introducing to Congress. President Johnson said, "There was no Negro problem. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem. Their cause must be our cause too, because it is not just Negroes. It is for all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome." Some 2,000 people set out from Selma on March 21st, protected by the U.S. Army troops and the Alabama National Guard forces that Johnson had ordered under federal control. After walking some 12 hours a day and sleeping in fields along the way, they reached Montgomery on March 25th. Nearly 50,000 supporters, black and white, met the marchers in Montgomery, where they gathered in front of the state capitol to hear King and other speakers, including Ralph Bunche, the winner of the 1950 Nobel Peace Prize, address the crowd. "No tide of racism can stop us," King proclaimed from the building steps as viewers around the world watched the historic moment on television. Lasting impact of the march. On March 17th, 1965, even as the Selma to Montgomery marchers fought for the right to carry out their protest, President Lyndon Johnson addressed a joint session of Congress, calling for federal voting rights legislation to protect African Americans from barriers that prevented them from voting. That August, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which guaranteed the right to vote, first awarded by the 15th Amendment, to all African Americans. Specifically, the act banned literacy tests as a requirement for voting, mandated federal oversight of voter registration in areas where tests had previously been used, and gave the U.S. Attorney General the duty of challenging the use of poll taxes for state and local elections. Along with the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act was one of the most expansive pieces of civil rights legislation in American history. It greatly reduced the disparity between black and white voters in the United States and allowed greater numbers of African Americans to participate in politics and government at the local, state, and national level. Thank you.